They told you Prohibition was about saving America from alcohol, about protecting families, cleaning the streets, and restoring morality. That's the lie they taught you in school. The truth is far more dangerous. Prohibition was never about ending drinking. It was about power. Imagine New York in 1921. The Volstead Act has just slammed shut every legal saloon and brewery. By day, the streets are dry, but by night, whiskey trucks roll in under police escort, speakeasies glow behind hidden doors, and the same politicians who outlawed liquor drink from crystal glasses in secret rooms. The law was for you, never for them. This wasn't a failed experiment in temperance. It was a carefully designed system to funnel wealth and control into the hands of men you never voted for. If you controlled liquor, you controlled entire cities. You bought judges. You owned the police. You dictated which businesses lived and which ones died. The newspapers told you about gangsters like Al Capone, violent, flashy, out of control. But they never told you who protected Capone. They never told you which banks laundered his millions or which senators quietly profited from keeping alcohol illegal. They gave you a villain to look at, so you'd never see the real architects standing in the shadows. What if Prohibition wasn't a moral crusade gone wrong, but a success for the people who planned it? What if the real goal was to break ordinary Americans, make them dependent on underground networks, and corrupt law enforcement so deeply it could never be trusted again? Look at the photographs from that era. Behind every jazz club and glamorous flapper dress was murder, bribery, and betrayal. Behind every smiling politician giving speeches about morality was a man cashing envelopes of blood money. This was more than liquor smuggling. It was a blueprint for how power would operate in America for the next 100 years. If you follow this trail all the way down, you won't see Prohibition as history. You'll see it as a warning, a map of how laws are written to control you and how corruption hides in plain sight, waiting for you to believe the story you were told. Chicago, 1924, a city already rotting from the inside. The law says alcohol is illegal, but the streets tell a different story. Every block has its own speakeasy. Every alley echoes with the clatter of delivery trucks at midnight, and behind every door is a man on someone's payroll, a cop, a judge, a politician. You've heard the myth. Rival gangs fighting for territory, Capone against Moran, shootouts with Tommy guns. But this wasn't random chaos. Chicago wasn't a battlefield, it was a marketplace. And the product wasn't liquor, it was loyalty. Whoever could buy it controlled the city. The Chicago outfit didn't rise because it was bold. It rose because the men sworn to stop it were already on its side. Police raided speakeasies by day and drank in them by night. Judges crushed small-time bootleggers while protecting syndicate bosses who could pay. Even the mayor's office collected its share. The real story isn't that organized crime thrived. It's that it thrived with permission. The entire system was designed to keep honest men out and let powerful networks grow unchecked. Bootlegging wasn't just smuggling. It was a franchise, licensed by corruption itself. And it wasn't just Chicago. New York, Detroit, Philadelphia. Every major city had its own arrangement. Rival gangs didn't fight because of morals. They fought because someone else had bribed more police than they did. Law enforcement wasn't the enemy. It was a business partner. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans were caught in the middle. If you wanted a drink, you broke the law. If you wanted to stay in business, you paid protection. If you wanted justice, you learned quickly that justice was for sale. Prohibition didn't just criminalize liquor. It criminalized life itself. Think about this. If every level of authority is corrupt, where does a man turn? What happens to a society when the people enforcing the law are also the ones breaking it? That's the question nobody wanted answered. That's why the history books talk about colorful gangsters instead of the bankers, lawyers, and senators who kept them in power. This wasn't about morality. This was about control. And once that control was established, it didn't vanish when Prohibition ended. It became permanent. The men who learned how to buy cities during Prohibition didn't go away. They just moved into new industries and brought their methods with them. By 1926, Prohibition wasn't just a war over liquor. It had become a pipeline for money, weapons, and influence. And the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. The same networks smuggling whiskey were smuggling far more dangerous cargo. Wall Street bankers didn't mind Prohibition. They funded it. Behind closed doors, major financial houses quietly handled bootleg money. Illegal liquor profits flowed into legitimate banks, cleaned and reinvested. Criminal empires became respectable overnight. These weren't street thugs. They were businessmen in tailored suits, protected by the same institutions Americans trusted with their savings. And then there were the agencies. Prohibition gave birth to new federal powers. The Bureau of Prohibition, the Treasury's Enforcement Division, even early intelligence units. But instead of stopping crime, these agencies learned how to manage it. They decided which operations to crush and which to quietly protect. They turned law enforcement into a tool for choosing winners and eliminating rivals. There's evidence that during Prohibition, illegal shipping routes were used not just for alcohol, but for smuggling weapons, stolen goods, even narcotics. Why did authorities look the other way? Because those routes were valuable. They could be used for operations far beyond public knowledge. Think about it. When you create a black market worth billions, you don't just empower criminals. You create an entire shadow economy. Politicians learn to take envelopes of cash. Judges learn to bend. Federal agents learn to protect friendly operations. And once that culture of corruption sets in, it doesn't go away. It just changes names and moves into other industries. This is the part of Prohibition no one talks about, because it exposes something bigger than liquor. It shows how power uses law to create crime, then uses crime to consolidate. More power. It shows how corruption isn't an accident, it's a strategy. Ask yourself, if federal agencies were already deciding which criminals to shield in the 1920s, what else have they managed since? If bankers were cleaning mob money then, whose money do they clean today? Prohibition wasn't just an American social experiment. It was training for an elite class to learn how to operate outside the law while making sure you stay trapped inside it. By 1928, something had changed. Organized crime no longer waited in the alleys. It walked through the front door of American politics. The money from Prohibition had grown so enormous, so irresistible, that entire elections were bought before a single vote was cast. In Chicago, precinct captains who once handed out campaign flyers now delivered envelopes of bootleg cash to aldermen. In New York, mayors who promised to clean up the streets were secretly drinking in the same speakeasies they claimed to be raiding. And at the state and federal level, liquor money didn't just influence politics, it owned it. You see, power doesn't stay in the shadows forever. Once the syndicates realized they could control City Hall, they stopped bribing politicians and started creating them. Judges were hand-picked. Police chiefs were appointed based on loyalty, not law. Governors knew exactly where their campaign funds came from and what would happen if they forgot it. This is the part of history that gets scrubbed clean. You're told that Prohibition was enforced by heroic agents battling ruthless criminals, but the truth is far darker. The line between lawman and lawbreaker didn't just blur. It vanished. In city after city, the same men giving orders to the police were taking orders from the mob. Even presidents weren't untouched. Warren G. Harding's administration was riddled with corruption during the early Prohibition years, with bootleggers and oil men buying direct access to the White House. And while Harding's death in 1923 ended some scandals, it didn't end the culture. It spread. By the late 20s, political careers were built and destroyed by underground money. So when you hear about gang wars and public enemies, remember, these weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated moves in a larger game. A game where the winners weren't gangsters in fedoras, but men in tailored suits sitting in marble offices, pretending to serve the public while serving themselves. Prohibition didn't just corrupt individuals, it corrupted institutions. And once an institution learns how to sell its power, it never forgets the price. By 1930, the bootleg wars were cooling, not because crime had been defeated, but because crime had matured. The bloody street battles that once filled newspapers became bad for business. Too much attention, too many questions. So the men who ran Prohibition's underground empire learned something new: how to make violence unnecessary. Instead of Tommy guns, they used contracts. Instead of bribes shoved across bar tops, they used investments. The syndicates had made so much money from liquor that they no longer needed to fight over it. They could simply buy whatever they wanted. Factories, trucking companies, shipping lines, real estate. Prohibition had turned street gangs into businessmen. And the legitimate businessmen? They didn't resist. They partnered. Breweries and distilleries that had been forced to shut down found new life producing industrial alcohol, which was diverted and resold illegally. Trucking companies quietly moved whiskey along with normal cargo. Even banks took deposits from mob-backed companies without asking questions. Everyone made money, and everyone kept quiet. The genius of this new arrangement was simple. If crime looked respectable, fewer people noticed. A nightclub run by a gangster didn't seem dangerous if it served celebrities and politicians every weekend. A warehouse full of contraband didn't seem criminal if it had a lawyer on retainer and a friendly banker in its pocket. This is the stage of Prohibition no one talks about, when the underworld and the upper world merged, when the same men who had once ordered drive-by shootings now sat on boards of directors, when murder became a last resort because influence worked faster and left no fingerprints. The press still loved to write about gangsters like Capone, about flashy raids and courtroom drama, but the real power had already moved behind closed doors. The men who understood how to run an illegal empire also understood how to run a legal one, and Prohibition gave them the perfect training ground. Ask yourself, if crime can learn to look legitimate, how do you even see it anymore? If the men breaking the law are also the ones writing it, who's really in control? Prohibition didn't just make criminals rich, it made them untouchable. In 1933, America finally admitted Prohibition had failed, or at least that's what they told you. The noble experiment was over. Liquor was legal again. People filled the streets, raising glasses in celebration, thinking the nightmare of speakeasies, bootleg wars and corruption was finished. But they were wrong. Because the men who built their empires in the shadows weren't going to walk away. They didn't lose power when the law changed. They used that power to shape what came next. When alcohol became legal again, the syndicates didn't disappear. They simply stepped out of the dark and into legitimate business. The breweries, distilleries, trucking lines, and real estate companies they already controlled stayed in their hands. Only now, everything looked respectable. And then came the Great Depression. Banks collapsing, factories closing, millions out of work. For ordinary Americans, it was ruin. But for men with underground wealth, it was an opportunity. They bought property for pennies on the dollar. They acquired failing businesses that no one else could afford. While the country bled, they grew stronger. The same networks that once smuggled liquor now controlled construction, shipping, unions, entertainment, and politics. They didn't need to bribe every cop anymore. They owned the politicians who gave the orders. They didn't need to shoot rivals on the street. They crushed them in boardrooms. This is the untold legacy of Prohibition. It wasn't a temporary crime wave. It was a restructuring of American power. The lessons learned in those 13 years, how to corrupt institutions, how to buy influence, how to hide wealth in plain sight, became the blueprint for everything that came after. Look at the rise of Las Vegas, built on gambling money, laundered by the very men who once ran whiskey through the alleys of Chicago. Look at political machines that survived long after the speakeasies closed, fueled by cash from businesses born in the black markets of the 1920s. Repealing Prohibition didn't end corruption. It legalized it. And the men who had learned to thrive in darkness now wore suits, held offices, and gave speeches about law and order. The question isn't whether Prohibition failed. The question is whether it was ever meant to succeed at all. By the mid-1930s, the men forged in Prohibition weren't just businessmen, they were kingmakers. They had money when the country was starving. They had influence when ordinary Americans had none. And that influence didn't stay locked in the cities. It reached all the way to Washington. This is where the story stops being about gangsters and starts being about government. Political campaigns need funding. The Great Depression had dried up most legitimate sources, but the men who once smuggled liquor had vaults of cash ready to spend, and politicians, desperate to stay in power, were happy to take it. Suddenly, laws didn't just protect syndicates in New York or Chicago. They began to protect entire industries shaped by underground money. Decisions about banking, shipping, labor unions, and construction quietly favored men who had cut their teeth in bootlegging. Even federal appointments were influenced. You think corruption stopped at City Hall? It climbed the steps of the Capitol itself. And the genius of it all, it no longer looked like crime. A man who once paid bribes to keep whiskey flowing now funded a senator's campaign. A syndicate boss who once ordered drive-bys now sat on a state advisory board. The same tactics that corrupted local police now corrupted entire agencies. The networks of loyalty built in Prohibition became networks of power in government. Federal policy on taxation, banking, and transportation started shifting in ways that favored these men. The laws that once hunted them now served them, and because the country was in crisis, nobody asked questions. Survival was more important than scrutiny. This is the part of history no one likes to admit. That America's federal government learned to live with corruption, even depend on it. The lessons of Prohibition weren't erased when the liquor ban ended. They were absorbed, institutionalized. Perfected. Ask yourself, if crime can buy influence on a city block, what happens when it buys influence on a national scale? What happens when the same people who broke the law are now helping write it? Prohibition didn't just change who had money, it changed who held power in America forever. By the late 1930s, the lines between crime, business, and government were no longer lines at all. They had blurred into one seamless web. The men who once ran bootlegging empires in alleys and back rooms were now moving billions through boardrooms and brokerage houses. The game had changed, but the rules were the same. Money buys loyalty, and loyalty buys power. Wall Street, hungry for capital after the Depression, found willing partners in former Prohibition networks. Syndicate cash, laundered through shell companies, flowed into stocks, bonds, and industrial investments. Corporate executives who once denounced bootleggers were quietly accepting their money. No one questioned it. Why would they? It was profit, and profit hides everything. Corporations learned the same lesson the mob had learned during Prohibition. Legality is a matter of perception. A warehouse full of whiskey was illegal. A corporation buying that same whiskey under a legal license looked like innovation. A gangster with a ledger could become a respected businessman, and anyone who noticed was either too scared or too dependent to speak. Banks facilitated it. Loans were extended, investments approved, audits overlooked. Entire industries, shipping, transportation, manufacturing, were now controlled by networks built in the shadow world of Prohibition, and yet the public never saw it. They saw jobs, economic recovery, and progress. They didn't see the invisible hands steering the flow of capital, shaping policy, and rewarding loyalty over law. The result was subtle, but powerful. Corruption became structural. It no longer needed Tommy guns, raids, or headlines. It didn't need the spectacle of gang wars. Instead, it operated quietly, invisibly, like a dark current beneath the surface of American prosperity. The men who had once killed for territory now killed with contracts, regulations, and in mouths, fluence, and they did it legally. This is the secret history of Prohibition. Not the gunfights and raids you've seen in movies, but the invisible architecture of power it created. The very system that once punished the common man now rewarded the men who controlled the flow of money, law, and influence. If you trace it forward, you realize the world you think you know. The corporate empires, the political machines, even the government itself, carries the fingerprints of lessons learned in those 13 years of illegal liquor and institutional corruption. Even as the Tommy guns fell silent on city streets, violence never truly disappeared. It became quieter, smarter, and far more effective. The same men who once settled disputes with bullets now settled them with threats, intimidation, and carefully timed ruin. Prohibition had taught them one lesson above all: power is enforced, whether publicly or privately. Gangs that once fought over liquor territory now acted as invisible security for corporations and politicians. A competitor threatening profits didn't need a shootout in the alley. A threat, a ruined shipment, or a strategically leaked scandal achieved the same effect. Violence became a tool, hidden in plain sight, always reminding everyone who really controlled the game. The public saw the arrests, the headlines about gang wars, the occasional public execution of a criminal. They never saw the letters, the contracts, the silent phone calls that enforced obedience in the shadows. And those who did see it often didn't survive long enough to speak. Even after Prohibition ended, this system persisted. Businesses aligned themselves with the networks that had survived the raids. Politicians knew which donors were backed by muscle and which were merely empty threats. The architecture of fear that kept cities obedient during the alcohol wars had been upgraded. Subtle, invisible, almost untouchable. This was the hidden continuity of power. Public violence was theater, private violence was policy, and it ensured that loyalty was never optional. You could make money, but only if you understood the rules of the shadow economy that ran America behind the veneer of law and order. Every boardroom, every shipping contract, every political decision had an echo of those violent lessons. The men who had once smuggled whiskey through back alleys had learned that influence without enforcement is meaningless. They never forgot, and they passed that lesson down to the next generation, making sure that the new order of business and government operated with quiet authority, enforced by both wealth and fear. So when you think of Prohibition as a historical curiosity, remember this: the violence, the corruption, the intimidation didn't vanish with the repeal. It evolved, it became invisible, and it still shapes the rules of power in America today. Prohibition wasn't just a war on alcohol. It was a war on perception. It taught Americans to obey laws that weren't meant to protect them, to fear authorities who were secretly working against them, and to accept hypocrisy as normal. It was the first great experiment in national psychological conditioning. Think about it. Ordinary citizens were forced to break the law just to live normally. Families hid bottles in basements. Speakeasy doors were whispered passwords. Neighbors turned blind eyes. Every drink became an act of rebellion, or a test of survival. And in every case, the men running the system watched and profited. Meanwhile, authority figures, police, judges, politicians, were trained to appear moral while acting corrupt. Every raid, every public arrest, every newspaper headline reinforced obedience, but hid the real rules: loyalty to power, not to law. Citizens learned to respect uniforms and signs of authority, even as the men wearing them were secretly allies of organized crime. This created a paradox. People were punished for minor acts of defiance, while the powerful operated with total impunity. They learned that morality was performative, that obedience could be bought, that society's rules were flexible, but only for those with knowledge, money, or access. Prohibition also shaped culture. Jazz clubs, flapper fashion, hidden speakeasies, these weren't just entertainment. They were a lesson in controlled freedom. Citizens could enjoy rebellion, but only in ways that never threatened the system. The illusion of liberty was carefully managed, while real power remained centralized, unseen, untouchable. And here's the kicker. This lesson didn't end when Prohibition did. Every American who came of age during those years internalized the rules of obedience and transgression. They learned how to break laws without consequence if you had influence, and how to follow laws without gaining safety if you didn't. That lesson became part of the national psyche. This is why prohibition matters even today. It wasn't just a failed law. It was a blueprint for how power manipulates populations through fear, hypocrisy, and controlled rebellion. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Halfway through this journey, it's time to act. Comment the phrase, "The law was never for us," twice. Lock it in your mind. Commit to seeing the truth beyond the surface and signal the algorithm that you're ready to continue down the path of forbidden knowledge. Prohibition created fortunes, influence, and power, but it also created bodies. Hundreds vanished in silence, never to be found. Men who crossed the wrong people disappeared quietly, their fates erased from newspapers, their deaths buried in whispers. And the reason these stories are nearly forgotten is the same reason prohibition succeeded. The powerful controlled the narrative. Take Chicago in the early 1920s. Enforcers for rival syndicates didn't just shoot rivals in public for headlines. They made people vanish. Owners of bars who refused to pay protection fees, truck drivers who betrayed shipments, even small-time informants, many were never seen again. The police often claimed ignorance, but in reality, some officers were complicit, others were terrified, and most knew speaking out meant a one-way ticket into the shadows themselves. Then there were the politicians and law enforcement officers who got too curious. Some were found floating in rivers, others in unmarked graves, officially listed as accidents or suicides. History books rarely mentioned them, because the files were lost or destroyed. And when families asked questions, they were warned. Curiosity could be dangerous. This was more than murder. It was a system of control, designed to silence dissent and instill obedience. Across the country, similar patterns emerged. Speakeasy owners in New York who refused to sell to certain syndicates vanished. Midwestern bootleggers who tried to operate independently disappeared overnight. Names that once circulated in local papers faded, leaving no trace beyond grainy photographs or the occasional police report quietly filed away. The message was clear. Power was absolute, invisible, and enforced. If you tried to step outside the system stepped back at you, permanently. Ordinary citizens learned, often too late, that rebellion could cost lives, and the men who orchestrated these disappearances weren't criminals in hiding anymore. They were integrated into society, operating openly as businessmen, bankers, and politicians, their pasts hidden behind the illusion of legitimacy. These vanishings weren't just collateral damage. They were a warning. Every unsolved murder, every missing person, every erased file reinforced the lesson. The world of power and money created during Prohibition had rules, and no one outside that world was safe if they crossed them. The truth is darker than any gangster story. And once you understand it, you begin to see the shadows behind every law, every policy, and every safe corner of American life. Prohibition didn't stop at America's borders. The men who mastered power in Chicago, New York, and Detroit quickly realized that opportunity extended beyond the coastline. Canada, the Caribbean, even parts of Europe became integral parts of the empire built on alcohol, influence, and secrecy. Whiskey, rum, and gin weren't the only commodities moving across borders. Ideas, loyalties, and leverage were being smuggled just as carefully. Connections with foreign officials ensured shipments moved undisturbed, while private docks and hidden warehouses acted as safe houses for men who were both criminals and businessmen. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a coordinated transnational system. Canadian distilleries thrived on bootlegging into the United States. Caribbean rum runners developed intricate networks of islands, ports, and shell companies. Even European financiers, many untouched by the chaos of Prohibition, began quietly laundering funds, recognizing that controlling American markets meant controlling American wealth. The system was invisible, yet immense. This international reach had consequences. It allowed syndicates to avoid exposure in ways domestic criminals couldn't. If law enforcement closed in on one operation, the enterprise simply shifted to another country, another port, another ally. Every move was calculated, every risk mitigated, and the ordinary citizen, the man who broke the law by buying a bottle in a hidden speakeasy, had no idea the global machinery behind his drink was already dictating policy, loyalty, and lives. Even governments were complicit. Canadian and Caribbean officials often turned blind eyes in exchange for bribes, favors, or political leverage. And American federal agencies. Many quietly monitored these operations, but allowed them to continue, understanding that international smuggling could also serve their own strategic interests. Prohibition, in effect, created a shadow international economy that trained men in the art of hidden power. The lesson is chilling. This was not random crime. It was education in influence, corruption, and control on a global scale. And the graduates of this school, men who learned how to navigate borders, bribe officials, and manipulate governments, didn't vanish when the Volstead Act was repealed. They simply expanded their empire, leaving fingerprints invisible to ordinary citizens, yet permanent in the corridors of power. Once you trace the lines, you realize the world we think of as orderly, lawful, and separated by borders is, in part, built on lessons learned smuggling whiskey in the shadows. Prohibition didn't just create criminals and businessmen, it created a new kind of law enforcement, one that learned how to fight crime without ever truly confronting it. Federal agencies, local police, and intelligence units all evolved during this period, but not always in the way history tells you. The Bureau of Prohibition, formed to enforce the Volstead Act, was quickly overwhelmed. But instead of dismantling crime, they learned how to manage it. They tracked shipments, monitored networks, and recorded alliances, not to stop the flow, but to predict it, control it, and use it when convenient. Intelligence gathering became a tool for power, not justice. Meanwhile, gangs and syndicates were learning the same lessons. They understood how to hide operations in plain sight, manipulate informants, and co-opt law enforcement. Surveillance, coded communications, and bribery became standard practices. The very techniques designed to protect citizens were being taught to criminals and officers alike, creating a mirror system of control where law and crime could look identical from the outside. These lessons didn't disappear when Prohibition ended. Many of the men and methods carried forward into the FBI, federal intelligence, and later anti-organized crime programs. Wiretaps, informant networks, undercover operations, all were refined during Prohibition's shadow economy. They were first used not just against gangsters, but to manage them, to protect interests, and to maintain a balance of power. Even local police forces were not innocent. Officers learned who could be bought, who could be intimidated, and which operations could be allowed to flourish for personal gain. A culture of complicity was institutionalized, and for decades afterward, it shaped the way law enforcement operated, often quietly favoring power over justice. The terrifying truth is this: many systems, we believe protect society, were born in a world designed to exploit it. Prohibition created both the criminals and the rules to contain them, and those rules became permanent. Ordinary citizens remained at the mercy of a system they could never fully understand, while the men who built it continued to thrive in the shadows, teaching future generations the art of invisible control. Once you see this, it changes everything. The next time law enforcement or intelligence agencies act in secrecy, you realize it may not be a failure, but a continuation of strategies perfected during the age of bootleggers and speakeasies. Prohibition wasn't just about liquor, crime, or politics. It was also about controlling what the public saw, believed, and remembered. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and magazines became tools in a larger game of influence. What the people knew was carefully curated. What they didn't know was even more deliberate. Gangster shootouts sold papers. Flashy raids entertained readers. Front-page headlines screamed of moral decay and public danger. But the newspapers never reported the full story. Who protected the gangs, who profited from their operations, and which politicians and businessmen were secretly steering the chaos. You were given villains to focus on, while the architects of power remained invisible. Media manipulation during Prohibition became a template for controlling public perception. Sensationalized violence distracted from systemic corruption. Heroic law enforcement stories masked complicity and fear. Jazz clubs, flappers, and speakeasy glamour normalized minor rebellion, teaching citizens that breaking the law was entertaining but safe, as long as you stayed small and invisible. Advertising and sponsorships reinforced the lesson. Brands aligned with media outlets knew how to present an image of respectability, even when backed by illicit funds. Reporters were encouraged, sometimes bribed, sometimes threatened, to write the stories that maintained the illusion. What you read and heard was curated by invisible hands, shaping perception to protect the true sources of power. Even more insidious, the culture created a psychological pattern. Americans learned to admire spectacle and ignore structure. They cheered for gangsters in movies, not realizing the same men were quietly buying legitimate companies and influencing laws. They feared petty criminals but trusted officials who were silently corrupt. The lesson was subtle: obey the law, but only the law too. That matters to those in power. By the time Prohibition ended, media control had been perfected. People were trained to see crime as a performance, morality as selective, and authority as absolute, even when authority was deeply compromised. This conditioning persists. The systems of influence, manipulation, and narrative control built during those years continue to shape public perception today. The lesson is clear. To understand the real world, you must look beyond what is shown. History is curated. Power writes the narrative. And if you never question it, you will always be a spectator in someone else's game. History rarely remembers the men and women who tried to resist Prohibition's networks. They weren't famous gangsters or politicians. They were shop owners, honest cops, journalists, and ordinary citizens who refused to bow to the invisible rules. And almost without exception, they paid the price. Take the small bar owner in New York who refused to sell to a powerful syndicate. His doors were smashed, his shipments stolen, and eventually he vanished without explanation. No newspaper followed the story. No federal investigation was publicized. To the world, he was just another victim of crime. In reality, he was a warning to anyone considering independence. Cops who attempted to enforce the law without compromise found themselves reassigned, threatened, or quietly eliminated. Judges who tried to convict organized crime figures faced bribes, character assassinations, or intimidation. And journalists who dug too deep discovered that newspapers could be bought, stories buried, and reputations destroyed overnight. Resistance was never meant to succeed. It was meant to demonstrate the reach and ruthlessness of the system. Even ordinary citizens learned this lesson. People who refused to pay protection fees or follow the network's unwritten rules disappeared or were financially ruined. Some survived by submission, others by silence, but very few truly challenged the system and lived to tell the story. Fear became an invisible leash, teaching Americans to obey without understanding why. What's crucial to understand is the scale of this control. Resistance was not just punished, it was erased. Names, records, evidence, all traces of defiance vanished into carefully managed silence. And in erasing resistance, the networks ensured that the public never fully understood how deeply the corruption had penetrated society. This is why Prohibition's legacy is so powerful. It did the shit. I didn't just teach criminals how to thrive. It taught society that power is enforced quietly, that rebellion is dangerous, and that obedience is rewarded, or at least safe. These lessons shaped generations. They trained citizens to accept authority even when it is corrupt, and to fear stepping outside the rules, even when the rules are designed to protect the powerful, not them. Every person who resisted, disappeared, or was silenced serves as proof. Prohibition wasn't just a law. It was a classroom in power, fear, and obedience. And the curriculum still affects the world we live in today. When Prohibition ended in 1933, most Americans assumed the era of corruption, violence, and underground empires had ended too. But the truth is far darker. The networks forged during those 13 years didn't vanish. They evolved, moving seamlessly into law, finance, and policy, leaving fingerprints on the systems we rely on today. Consider banking. The same banks that quietly laundered bootleg money learned how to move vast sums without scrutiny. They built networks for influence, investing in industries connected to politicians and corporations loyal to the syndicates. Money that was once illegal became a tool to control entire sectors of the economy. Lawmakers, too, had learned lessons during Prohibition. Campaign funding, lobbying, and legislative favors became mechanisms of subtle control. Politicians learned which legal avenues could serve the powerful while giving the illusion of fairness to the public. Entire policies, taxation, regulation, enforcement, were designed to protect the interests of those who had mastered the rules in the shadows. Even law enforcement retained lessons from the bootlegging era. Surveillance methods, informant networks, and intelligence-gathering techniques perfected during Prohibition were later applied to broader criminal, political, and economic oversight. Agencies now controlled both compliance and punishment, often shaping outcomes to favor the influential, while keeping ordinary citizens unaware. Corporations absorbed these practices too. Companies that survived Prohibition or thrived afterward maintained networks of loyalty, leverage, and silent enforcement. Business decisions were no longer based purely on market logic. They were influenced by relationships forged in the era of illegal power. Contracts, favors, and discreet threats ensured compliance without public scrutiny. This created a system almost impossible to see from the outside. Rules applied differently depending on who you were. Success, protection, or punishment depended less on law or merit, and more on understanding, wealth, and loyalty. The very institutions designed to enforce fairness, banks, courts, agencies, became extensions of the networks that rose from Prohibition's chaos. The lesson is chilling. Prohibition wasn't just a failed law. It was a masterclass in power, teaching how to operate above scrutiny, manipulate systems, and maintain influence long after the spotlight moved elsewhere. The structures of control built then continue to shape politics, finance, and society today. Unseen, normalized, and almost untouchable. Prohibition didn't just teach men how to control money, law, and politics. It taught them how to control minds. Ordinary Americans, unknowingly, became part of an experiment in psychological manipulation, a lesson in obedience, distraction, and perception that echoes to this day. Citizens were trained to see crime as a spectacle, morality as selective, and authority as absolute. Speakeasies, jazz clubs, and hidden parties taught subtle lessons. Rebellion could be glamorous but contained. Pleasure could exist only in the spaces allowed by those in power. Breaking the law became normalized, but only in ways that never threatened the networks controlling it. Media reinforced the illusion. Headlines screamed about gang wars while hiding the men who truly profited. Movies celebrated criminal glamour while quietly embedding lessons in loyalty and obedience. The culture conditioned people to admire spectacle, ignore systemic corruption, and trust authority, even when it was compromised. Fear was another tool. Disappearances, unsolved murders, and publicized arrests taught citizens that crossing invisible lines could cost lives. Ordinary people internalized these lessons, obey, pay tribute, or vanish into silence. This psychological conditioning didn't end with the repeal of Prohibition. It persisted through decades, shaping how Americans respond to power, authority, and law. Education and society reinforced it subtly. Children learned morality through selective stories. Adults learned survival through compromise. The system created generations accustomed to seeing only what leaders wanted them to see. They learned to respect uniforms, follow rules, and cheer spectacle, all while missing the invisible hands shaping outcomes. The result is chilling. You walk through a world structured to reward loyalty to power, punish curiosity, and enforce compliance through culture, syndicates, awe and psychology. You think you are free, but your decisions, perceptions, and even fears were conditioned long before you realized. Prohibition wasn't just a historical misstep. It was a blueprint in human behavior, a study in control, and a lesson in invisibility. Its shadows linger in every law, every media narrative, every system of authority. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. Halfway past section 17, pause and reflect. Comment the phrase, "I see the invisible hand" twice. Lock it into your awareness, signal your commitment to truth, and prepare yourself for the deeper revelations ahead. Prohibition didn't end with the 21st Amendment. It simply shifted shape, embedding itself in the networks of power that still influence America today. The men who learned to manipulate law, finance, and culture didn't vanish. They passed their methods to the next generation. And those methods endure. Follow the threads, and you'll see it clearly. Corporations built on Prohibition-era cash still wield influence. Families that controlled bootlegging empires quietly entered legitimate industries: banking, real estate, energy, and entertainment. Politicians with Prohibition-era ties helped craft policies favoring these interests. Laws, regulations, and taxation weren't accidental. They were carefully shaped to protect power, conceal wealth, and reward loyalty. Even today, the fingerprints remain. Campaign finance, lobbying, corporate bailouts, and regulatory loopholes are modern expressions of strategies perfected during the age of hidden whiskey and speakeasy money. Influence, intimidation, and manipulation became a playbook, inherited by every person who understood the lessons of the 1920s underground economy. And the frightening part? These networks are largely invisible. The public sees elections, stock markets, and corporate mergers, but rarely the silent negotiations, undisclosed deals, and alliances forged decades ago. Decisions affecting millions are shaped by interests that trace back to bootlegging empires, Prohibition-era unions, and political machines perfected in the shadows. Violence, bribery, and intimidation may be less visible today, replaced by contracts, influence, and legal loopholes. But the principles remain unchanged. The same strategies that made Chicago and New York obedient in the 1920s now guide global corporations, political campaigns, and financial institutions. Ordinary citizens continue to be spectators in a system designed to operate above scrutiny. Prohibition was never just about alcohol. It was a masterclass in power, influence, and systemic control. And those lessons are alive, invisible, and operating every day, shaping society without ever appearing in textbooks or headlines. Once you see this, you can't ignore it. You understand that history is not behind us. It is a shadow over us, guiding decisions, shaping culture, and enforcing obedience to structures built long before most of us were born. By now, you can see the pattern. Prohibition wasn't a mistake, a moral crusade, or a fleeting chapter in American history. It was a laboratory of power, a blueprint for how influence, corruption, and control operate quietly, invisibly, and effectively. Every law written, every corporation founded, every political campaign funded, carries the echoes of those 13 years. Think about it. The same lessons that taught men to smuggle whiskey, bribe officials, and eliminate rivals silently were later applied to banking, real estate, unions, and politics. Violence became subtle. Bribery became contracts. Intimidation became influence. The streets may have gone quiet, but the structures they built beneath the surface only grew stronger, more resilient, and far more sophisticated. Modern America is built on the principles learned during that era. The networks of power that shaped legislation, controlled industries, and dictated media narratives are descendants of Prohibition. The elites who move money, manipulate politics, and shape policy are often heirs to those lessons, either directly through lineage or indirectly through systems perfected in secret. And here is the unsettling truth. Ordinary citizens, no matter how law-abiding, remain participants in a system designed to obscure real power. Every election, every market shift, every legal or financial decision happens within the invisible framework established by men who learned how to thrive in darkness. They learned that rules are tools, pliable, selective, and enforceable only against those without access to power. This is why history feels repeated, why patterns of corruption, influence, and hidden control persist. It's not coincidence. It is a continuation of strategies perfected during Prohibition, designed to teach obedience, enforce loyalty, and reward the invisible elite while leaving the rest of societies blind to the machinery guiding it. Once you understand this, you can no longer view law, authority, or culture in the same way. What appears legitimate may be orchestrated. What seems random may be planned. And what you believe protects you may in fact protect only those who understand the rules hidden from the rest of us. History is not behind us. It is here. It is present. And the shadow of Prohibition still runs through the veins of power in America today. Now, after everything you've seen, heard, and understood, you realize the truth. Prohibition never ended. It only transformed. The streets quieted, laws changed, and speakeasies closed, but the lessons learned in those 13 years, in fear, influence, corruption, and control, never disappeared. They evolved, became invisible, and became permanent. The men who once smuggled whiskey became the architects of institutions. Their descendants, apprentices, and the systems they built still operate today, quietly shaping the economy, politics, law enforcement, media, and culture. Power learned to hide in plain sight, to disguise itself as legality, morality, or progress, while continuing to enforce obedience, manipulate perception, and reward loyalty above all else. Look around. Every structure you trust, banks, corporations, government agencies, even media outlets, carries the imprint of Prohibition's hidden legacy. Decisions you believe are impartial are often influenced by invisible hands trained in the art of subtle control. The rules you follow, the laws you obey, the norms you respect, were all designed in part to favor those who understand the system and enforce it silently. And here is the most disturbing part. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You cannot look at authority, law, or culture the same way. You begin to understand the choreography behind headlines, the orchestration behind policy, the strategy behind influence. Ordinary life, which once felt safe and predictable, now appears orchestrated, governed by hidden currents you were never meant to notice. This is the final lesson of Prohibition. Power does not disappear when laws fail. It adapts, it becomes invisible, and it endures. The knowledge you now carry changes you, because understanding the hidden rules of control gives you sight that most will never have. You are now aware of the system, beneath the system, the shadows behind the curtain, the invisible hand shaping everything. History tried to hide it. Society teaches obedience to it. But you know the truth, and once you know, you cannot forget. You cannot ignore. You are no longer merely a spectator. You are awake. You are aware. And that changes everything.